David Carter had seen many strange things in his time as a diplomat for the Terran Coalition, but nothing had prepared him for this. He stood in the grand throne room of the Zephyr Empire, a vast alien civilization known for its advanced technology and strict traditions. The towering figure before him, Queen Seraphis, radiated authority. Her golden robes shimmered under the light, and her piercing gaze locked onto him as she made an announcement that stunned the entire court. "The human will live with my daughter, Princess Valera." The hall fell into silence. David blinked, sure that he had misheard. He glanced at the alien officials standing around the Queen's throne. Some looked shocked, others whispered among themselves. A few glared at him with open disapproval. "I apologize, Your Majesty," David said carefully, choosing his words. "But could you clarify what you mean by that?" The Queen's golden eyes narrowed slightly. "It is as I have spoken. From this moment, you will reside within the royal palace alongside my daughter. This is my command." David felt the weight of the moment. This was not a request. It was a royal decree. He was being ordered to stay. But why? A sharp voice cut through the tension. "This is absurd." David turned to see a tall, regal-looking alien woman stepping forward. Her deep violet skin and silver hair marked her as one of the Zephyr nobility. She looked at David as if he were an insect that had wandered into her home. A human cannot be trusted to live alongside royalty. "What purpose does this serve, Queen Seraphis?" she demanded. The Queen, unfazed, simply lifted a hand. "It is not your concern, Minister Valix." David remained calm, but inside, his mind raced. He had come to the Zephyr homeworld to negotiate trade agreements, not to become part of the royal household. Why was the Queen forcing this? Before he could speak, the throne room doors opened, and the crowd shifted. A tall, imposing figure entered, a young woman with midnight black hair, piercing blue eyes, and an aura of cold confidence. Princess Valera. She walked toward the throne with perfect posture, her armor like royal attire emphasizing her status. She barely glanced at David before addressing her mother. "This is unnecessary," she said coolly. "I do not require a human living with me." The Queen's gaze was unwavering. "You will do as I have commanded." For a moment, Valera's jaw tightened. Then, with a curt nod, she turned to David. "Follow me." David hesitated but knew he had no choice. The court watched as he followed the princess out of the throne room, his mind filled with unanswered questions. Inside the palace was massive, its walls covered in intricate carvings that told the history of the Zephyr Empire. Valera walked ahead of him, not bothering to slow her pace. David finally decided to break the silence. "So, you're not happy about this either?" Valera stopped abruptly and turned to him. "Do not assume we are allies just because we both dislike this arrangement, human." David raised an eyebrow. "You can call me David." Valera's expression didn't change. "You will stay in the guest wing. Do not interfere in my affairs. Do not assume you have any importance here." David folded his arms. "That's an odd way to treat a guest." Valera's eyes flashed with irritation. "You are not a guest. You are an obligation." She turned sharply and walked away, leaving David standing there. He exhaled slowly, already realizing this was going to be a very long assignment. A mysterious purpose. Later that evening, as David settled into his quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. Why had the Queen chosen him specifically? Why had she forced her daughter into this situation? One thing was clear. He was now entangled in Zephyr politics, and whatever game the Queen was playing, he would have to figure it out before it was too late. David Carter sat in his new quarters within the Zephyr Royal Palace, still trying to process what had happened. The room was spacious, adorned with alien symbols and soft, glowing lights that hummed faintly. The bed was massive, made of a material he couldn't identify, and everything around him felt strange. Too clean, too structured, too alien. He had lived on other planets before, but this was different. He wasn't here as a diplomat anymore. He was an obligation. The queen had ordered him to stay with Princess Valara, but she clearly wanted nothing to do with him. That much was obvious from the way she had spoken to him earlier. David sighed, rubbing his forehead. Why me? Breakfast with the princess. The next morning, a royal attendant came to his room and informed him that he was expected to join Princess Valara for breakfast. He wasn't sure if this was a tradition or a punishment, but he had no choice but to go. When he entered the dining hall, he found Valara already seated at the long, silver-colored table. Her piercing blue eyes barely acknowledged him as she picked at her meal, a strange, glowing fruit and something that looked like thin strips of meat. A servant gestured for David to sit. The chair felt too stiff, too formal. He picked up a piece of fruit and took a careful bite. It tasted surprisingly sweet, with a sharp aftertaste. Valara finally spoke, her voice as cold as ever. You eat like a primitive. David blinked and swallowed his food. Well, good morning to you too. She didn't reply, focusing on her meal instead. David studied her. She was elegant yet distant, like a perfectly sculpted statue, beautiful but untouchable. After a moment of silence, he sighed. Look, if we have to live under the same roof, maybe we should at least try to get along. Valara set her fork down and looked at him. Get along. She scoffed. You do not understand why you are here, do you? David shrugged. The queen ordered it. I assume she has her reasons. Valara's eyes narrowed slightly. My mother does not make decisions without purpose. If she placed you here, it is because she believes I need to learn something from you. David smirked. Well, I'm honored. Valara gave him a blank stare before standing up. Finish your meal. Do not waste food. She turned and walked away, leaving David alone at the table. A test of strength. Later that day, David was taken to a training hall by a palace attendant. The room was vast, with high ceilings and various weapons mounted on the walls. He was surprised to find Valara waiting for him, dressed in combat attire. A sleek, dark bodysuit that moved like a second skin. She held a long, curved weapon in her hands. David frowned. What's this? Valara spun the weapon effortlessly. A demonstration. I need to understand what a human is capable of. David crossed his arms. You're testing me. Valara smirked. No, I am evaluating you. A servant tossed David a simple wooden staff. He caught it and sighed. Great. I love getting beat up before lunch. Valara didn't wait. She lunged forward, striking fast. David barely had time to react, raising his staff just in time to block her attack. The force rattled his arms, and he stumbled back. She's strong. He quickly adjusted, using his training from his military days. He dodged her next strike and managed to tap her side with the end of his staff. It wasn't enough to hurt her, but it surprised her. Valara's eyes flickered with mild amusement. Not entirely useless, she muttered before attacking again. For several minutes they clashed, David using speed and strategy, while Valara relied on precision and raw strength. Eventually, she disarmed him with a quick twist, sending his staff clattering across the floor. David raised his hands in surrender. All right, you win. Valara stared at him for a moment, then turned away. You are not as weak as I thought. David chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. A small break in the ice. That evening, David sat on the balcony of the palace, watching the two moons of the Zephyr homeworld rise into the sky. The alien world was breathtaking at night. Glowing rivers, shimmering sky, and a faint hum in the air that made everything feel alive. Valara unexpectedly appeared beside him. David glanced at her, couldn't sleep. Valara didn't answer immediately. Then she said, You fought well today. David smirked. Again, I'll take that as a compliment. Valara remained silent for a moment. Humans are unpredictable. That is why my mother brought you here. David raised an eyebrow. To teach you about unpredictability. Valara nodded slightly. Perhaps, or perhaps to prove that even the weakest species can adapt. David grinned. You keep calling humans weak, but we don't die easy. Valera finally looked at him, a small flicker of curiosity in her usually cold expression. I am beginning to see that. For the first time since arriving, David felt that maybe, just maybe, he had a chance to prove his worth in this alien world. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. David Carter was getting used to life in the Zephyr Royal Palace, but that didn't mean he understood it. Every day, he followed a routine: formal meals with Princess Valera, intense combat training, and endless lessons on Zephyr customs. It was a strange existence, and he still didn't know why the Queen had placed him here. One thing was certain: Valera was no longer openly hostile. She tolerated his presence now, and on rare occasions, she even seemed curious about him. But there was still something missing: the truth. Whispers in the palace. David was walking through one of the grand hallways when he noticed something odd. The Zephyr nobles, usually cold but polite, were whispering whenever he passed by. Their glances were filled with suspicion and doubt. He slowed his pace, pretending not to notice, but his ears caught fragments of conversation. Why did the Queen bring a human here? This is a disgrace, a lesser species living among us. Perhaps there is something more to this. David clenched his jaw but said nothing. He had dealt with this kind of thing before, being underestimated. It didn't bother him much, but it did make him wonder. Why had the Queen really chosen him? Confronting the Queen. That evening, David made a decision. He needed answers. He found Queen Seraphis in one of the palace chambers, standing before a massive holographic map of the Zephyr Empire. The Queen was a powerful figure, tall, elegant, and unreadable. Her golden eyes flicked toward David as he entered, but she said nothing. David took a deep breath. Your Majesty, I need to know the truth. The Queen's lips curved slightly. Truth is a matter of perspective, human. David didn't back down. You placed me in this palace, forced me to live with your daughter, and now I see the nobles watching me like I don't belong. Why? Queen Seraphis turned fully to face him. There was no anger, no impatience, just calm calculation. Tell me, David Carter, what do you think of my daughter? David hesitated, then answered honestly. She's strong, disciplined, smart, but she doesn't trust easily. The Queen nodded. And do you believe she is ready to rule? David frowned. She's capable, but she doesn't see the bigger picture yet. She follows the traditions of your empire, but she hasn't questioned them. Queen Seraphis smiled slightly, as if he had given the answer she was hoping for. That is why you are here. David's eyes narrowed. To teach her to question things. The Queen walked toward the window, gazing at the twin moons of her world. Valera has been raised in a world of power and control. She has been trained to be a warrior, a leader, and a ruler. But leadership is not only about strength, it is about understanding. And no Zephyr has ever truly understood humanity. David folded his arms. You want her to learn from me. Queen Seraphis turned back to him. More than that, I want her to see the galaxy through your eyes. You humans are unpredictable, adaptable, and resilient in ways my people are not. Valera must understand that if she is to be more than just a ruler, she must be a leader. David let out a slow breath. And what if she refuses to change? The Queen's expression remained unreadable. Then the future of the Zephyr Empire will be as rigid and unchanging as the past, and that will be its downfall. David was silent for a long moment. He had never expected this. He wasn't just here as a test. He was here to shape the next ruler of an entire empire. Valera's doubt. Later that night, David found Valera on the palace balcony, staring at the sky. The night was quiet, peaceful, but there was tension in her posture. He stepped beside her. I spoke to your mother. Valera didn't look at him. I know. David exhaled. She wants you to learn from me. Valera's grip tightened on the balcony railing. I do not need a human to teach me how to rule. David studied her face. Maybe not. But maybe leadership isn't just about strength. Maybe it's about knowing when to listen. Valera turned to him, her blue eyes sharp. You believe I am unfit to lead? David shook his head. No, I think you could be the greatest leader your people have ever had, but not if you refuse to grow. For the first time, Valera didn't have an immediate response. She simply stared at him, deep in thought. David knew then the real battle had begun. The tension between David Carter and Princess Valera had shifted. It was no longer simple hostility or indifference. It was something more complex. David knew she didn't trust him, but she was starting to question things, and that was progress. Still, there was one undeniable truth. Valera was stubborn. Training and tension. The next morning, David found himself back in the Royal Training Hall. The air was thick with the smell of polished metal and sweat from previous training sessions. Valera stood before him, weapon in hand, her expression unreadable. You will fight me again, she said. David sighed. Didn't we do this already? Valera tilted her head slightly. You lasted longer than expected last time. I want to see if it was luck or skill. David smirked. I'll take that as a compliment. She didn't respond. She simply attacked. David barely had time to dodge. Her speed was incredible, her strikes sharp and calculated. Unlike last time, she wasn't holding back. She was testing him. David gritted his teeth and countered, using his agility and human instinct to avoid her more brutal attacks. He managed to land a solid hit on her shoulder with his staff, but she barely flinched. Instead of getting angry, she smiled. You're learning, she admitted. David adjusted his stance. And you're enjoying this. Valera didn't deny it. She attacked again, faster this time. They sparred for several minutes, but David was running out of stamina. Valera, however, still moved with the same precision as when they started. Finally, she disarmed him, sending his weapon flying across the room. David landed hard on his back, groaning. Valera stood over him, her piercing blue eyes studying him. You are weaker than me, she said simply. David exhaled. Yeah, thanks for the reminder. But Valera added, stepping back, you fight with more than strength. You adapt. David slowly sat up, rubbing his shoulder. Well, humans don't have the luxury of being the strongest species in the galaxy. We survive by being clever. Valera's expression remained unreadable. Perhaps that is why my mother placed you here. David frowned. You're starting to believe her, aren't you? Valera didn't answer. Instead, she turned away. You are done for today. Rest. David watched her leave, realizing something important. He wasn't just proving himself to her anymore. She was starting to see things differently. An unexpected conversation. That night, David was surprised to find Valera waiting for him on the palace balcony. She rarely sought him out. This was new. He walked over and leaned on the railing beside her. Couldn't sleep. Valera was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. My people do not change easily. David raised an eyebrow. Is that why you're thinking about what your mother said? Valera exhaled softly. She believes I need to learn from you. She turned to face him. But what about you? Do you think I need to change? David considered his answer. I think you're already strong, but strength alone isn't enough to lead an empire. Valera studied him. And what do you believe is missing? David shrugged. Understanding. You see humans as weaker, but you're starting to realize we're different. We're unpredictable. We don't always follow logic, and we fight even when we know we might lose. Valera looked at him thoughtfully. You risk your life to save me in training. Why? David smirked. Because that's what we do. Valera didn't look away this time. For the first time since they met, she seemed to be truly considering his words. And that was progress. But neither of them knew that trouble was already brewing in the shadows of the palace. David Carter was finally making progress with Princess Valera. Their uneasy alliance had shifted. She was beginning to listen, to question things. But something felt off. The palace was different these past few days. Guards seemed more tense. Nobles whispered more than usual. Something was wrong. A silent warning. One evening, as David walked through the palace halls, he noticed one of the palace servants, a young Sci-Fi woman with pale blue skin, looking at him with nervous eyes. She quickly turned away, but David had seen that look before. Fear. He approached her cautiously. Something wrong. The servant hesitated, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. Then, in a hushed voice, she whispered, "You should leave, human. It is not safe here." David's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" But before she could answer, a loud chime echoed through the halls, a signal for the evening gathering of the royal court. The servant backed away quickly, disappearing into the shadows. David frowned. Something was coming, and he had no idea what. An explosion in the night. That night, the palace shook with an explosion. David woke up instantly, his instincts kicking in. Guards were shouting outside. The air smelled like burning metal and smoke. He grabbed his boots and ran, following the sound of chaos. As he turned a corner, he saw the source of the attack. A section of the palace had been blown apart, and flames were spreading. Then he saw her, Princess Valera, standing in the middle of the destruction. Her blue eyes were sharp, scanning the scene, her hands clenched into fists. She wasn't afraid. She was angry. David ran up to her. "Are you okay?" Valera nodded, her voice controlled but tense. "I am fine. But this was no accident." David already knew that. Someone had tried to attack the palace. But the real question was, who? Betrayal in the court. The royal guards moved quickly, putting out the fires and securing the area. Valera led David to the main throne room, where Queen Seraphis was already waiting. Her golden eyes were cold, unreadable. A group of Sci-Fi nobles stood before her, their faces tense and filled with hidden emotions. One of them, a tall noble with silver markings on his face, stepped forward. "This attack proves that the human does not belong here." Asterisk, asterisk. David narrowed his eyes. "You think this was about me?" The noble scoffed. "Of course. Ever since the queen brought you here, there has been unrest. Your presence is an insult to our traditions. And now, look, our palace burns." David could feel the tension in the room. This wasn't just an accusation, it was a challenge. Valera took a step forward. "You assume much, Minister Valix. There is no proof that this attack was because of the human." The noble's lips curled slightly. "Then why not remove him? If he is not the cause, then there is no harm in sending him away." David felt Valera stiffen beside him. She didn't turn to look at him, but he knew she was struggling with something. Queen Seraphis spoke then, her voice calm but sharp. "You forget your place, Minister Valix." The noble flinched, but didn't back down. The queen continued, "This attack was meant to cause division, and you have fallen into its trap." Silence fell. The queen had seen through it. This was never about David. It was about power. David exhaled slowly. Someone was trying to force him out. Or worse, they were trying to shake Valera's control. And that meant this wasn't over. Valera's decision. After the meeting, Valera led David to a private chamber. The doors shut behind them, and she turned to him with a serious expression. "You are in danger." David folded his arms. "That's nothing new." Valera frowned. "This attack was planned, and I believe the real target was me." David's eyes narrowed. "You think someone wants you dead?" Valera hesitated. "Not dead. Removed." David's mind worked quickly. "Because you're different. Because you're next in line to rule, and your mother is trying to change the way things work." Valera nodded. "There are those who wish to keep our empire the same. They see my mother's decisions as weakness. And now, they see me as a threat. David leaned against the wall, exhaling. And me. Valera looked at him, her blue eyes holding something different now, not just calculation, but something close to trust. You're part of this now, whether you want to be or not. David smirked. Well, that's great. I was getting bored anyway. Valera didn't laugh, but she did something close to it, a small, amused exhale. But the moment passed quickly. She stepped closer. You should leave. If they think you are the reason for this, they will come for you next. David's smile faded. Not happening. Valera frowned. You are being reckless. David shook his head. No, I'm being human. Valera held his gaze for a long moment. Then finally she sighed. Then we will fight together. David grinned. Now that's more like it. The palace had never felt so tense. Every corner seemed to whisper with hidden motives. Every shadow felt like a lurking threat. David Carter and Princess Valera knew something was coming. They could feel it. The quiet before the storm was heavier than ever, and the air seemed thick with impending danger. Valera had made her decision. They would face this threat head-on. There was no turning back now. Preparing for the unknown. The next morning, David and Valera met in the palace training hall, now eerily quiet compared to the usual bustle. The guards were on high alert, but the two of them knew that preparation was key. David checked his gear, a simple sword at his side, and a blaster for more urgent situations. Valera was already dressed in her battle attire, her dark blue armor gleaming under the artificial light. She looked every bit the warrior she was. Powerful, sharp, and ready for anything. I've spoken to my mother, Valera said, her voice quiet but firm. She knows the attack was meant to divide us. There are traitors among us, those who would rather see us fall than see change. David nodded. The ones who don't want you to rule right. Valera's jaw tightened. Yes, they fear that my leadership will bring change that they cannot control. David walked over to a nearby table where several maps of the palace were spread out. He pointed to a narrow corridor on the map. This is where I think they'll come from. It's the shortest route to the Queen's chambers, and it's secluded enough to stay hidden. Valera studied the map, her eyes narrowing as she considered the path. You're right. They would strike at the heart of the palace, right where my mother holds her power. David continued, his mind working fast. We need to prepare to block that route. I'll take the lower levels, and you cover the upper floors. Valera nodded. It will be a fight, but we will face it together. David couldn't help but admire her. She wasn't the same cold princess he had met all those days ago. She had grown, not just in strength, but in resolve. The first strike. The palace was already on edge, but the first signs of trouble came when the lower levels' alarms began to blare. David immediately grabbed his blaster and ran toward the sound. His heart pounded in his chest. This was it. He quickly reached the hallway leading to the lower levels, where a few guards had already gathered. The doors had been tampered with, and the intruders were already inside. David moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows. He had to act before the traitors could get any further. He spotted the first group of assailants, a mix of Scifi nobles and mercenaries, dressed in dark clothing, moving stealthily through the corridors. They looked like they were searching for something or someone. David couldn't wait any longer. He raised his blaster, taking careful aim before firing. The shot rang out, and the nearest mercenary dropped to the ground, unconscious. Valera's battle. Meanwhile, Valera was already in the heart of the palace, moving quickly through the corridors, her sword in hand. She had seen the signs. She knew the attackers would be coming from all sides, and she was ready. As she entered the main hall, she heard the clash of metal. Someone was already fighting her guards. She moved with precision, her sword cutting through the air as she engaged the enemy. Her eyes locked onto the traitors. Valera wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for the future of her empire. She slashed at one of the attackers, her sword meeting his chest armor, knocking him back. He tried to regain his footing, but she was faster. With a fluid movement, she disarmed him, sending his weapon flying. "You've made a grave mistake," Valera said coldly as she prepared for the next attacker. David's encounter. Back in the lower levels, David was closing in on the main group of attackers when he suddenly found himself face to face with Minister Valix, the Scifi noble who had openly challenged him before. "So, it's you," David said, his voice low but steady. "I should have known." Valix smirked, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "You think you can stop me, human?" David didn't hesitate. "I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to make sure you don't get any further." The two men squared off, their eyes locked. Valix drew his dagger, and David tightened his grip on his blaster. It was clear. This wasn't going to be a battle of words. Valix lunged forward, slashing with the dagger. David barely had time to move out of the way, but he knew one thing. He had to survive. This fight wasn't just about him. It was about Valera's future, about protecting the Empire from those who wanted to destroy it. David sidestepped Valix's next attack, catching him off guard. With a quick twist of his arm, David knocked the dagger from Valix's hand, sending it clattering to the floor. "You lose," David said, his voice cold. "The battle is won." By the time Valera reached the lower levels, the traitors were defeated, their plans thwarted. David was standing over Minister Valix, who was on his knees, restrained by a few of the remaining guards. Valera walked up to them, her expression unreadable. "You failed," Valera said to Valix. "Your treachery ends here." David stepped back, his eyes meeting Valera's. "We did it." Valera nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "We did." But they both knew this was just the beginning. The battle for the throne was far from over. The battle had been intense, but the palace was still standing. The traitors had been defeated, and their plans were in ruins. David Carter and Princess Valera stood side by side, breathing heavily, surrounded by the wreckage of the fight. But there was no time for rest. This victory was only the beginning. Valera's gaze swept over the room, her blue eyes cold but focused. The palace was secure for now, but she knew that there would be more battles ahead. The factions that opposed her were not easily defeated. David looked at her, his heart still racing from the fight. "It's over. For now." Valera nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "It's never truly over. Not until the traitors are dealt with and the Empire is secure." David stepped closer, studying her. "You know, you're starting to sound like your mother." She gave him a small wry smile. "I'm learning from the best." David's mind went back to the conversation he had had with Queen Seraphis. The Queen had made it clear. Valera was the future of the Scifi Empire, but the road to the throne was far from smooth. A royal decision. That evening, after the dust had settled and the palace had been restored to order, Queen Seraphis called for an audience. David and Valera entered the royal chambers, where the queen awaited them. The air was thick with tension, but it was a tension of something different, of a future being decided. Seraphis stood tall, her golden eyes gleaming. "You both have done well." She turned to David. "You have proven that even a human can change the course of our fate. Your presence here has not been a mistake." David nodded, though he didn't feel like he had done anything extraordinary. "I was just doing my job." The queen smiled slightly. A humble answer, but one that speaks volumes. "You are more than just an ally to my daughter. You have proven yourself as a partner." David glanced at Valera, who stood quietly beside him. She looked at her mother, her face still as unreadable as ever. But there was a hint of something in her eyes, a kind of understanding, a realization of the journey she had already begun. "What will you do now, Your Majesty?" David asked, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. Seraphis looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with pride. "I have made my decision." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Valera is ready. The time has come for her to take her place as the rightful ruler of the Ziffer Empire. David was taken aback. "You're stepping down." Queen Seraphis nodded. "I have ruled for many years, but the future belongs to the next generation. My daughter is strong, capable, and she has the wisdom to lead." Valara stepped forward, her posture straight and proud. "I will not fail. I will lead with strength, but I will also lead with understanding." David could see it now. Valara was ready. A new era. The days that followed were filled with preparations for the official ceremony. Valara's coronation was a grand event, one that would mark the beginning of a new era for the Ziffer Empire. The traitors who had conspired against her were dealt with, and those who remained loyal to the old ways were forced to accept the change. David stood beside Valara during the ceremony, watching as she was crowned the new ruler of the Ziffer Empire. Her face was calm, but David could see the weight of responsibility in her eyes. When the crown was placed on her head, Valara looked out over the gathered crowd. Her voice rang out, firm and clear. "I will lead this empire with the strength it deserves. We will no longer live in the shadow of fear. We will embrace change and build a future where all voices are heard." The crowd erupted into applause, but David could see the sincerity in her words. She wasn't just a warrior princess anymore. She was a ruler. A future together. After the ceremony, Valara and David stood on the palace balcony, watching the stars above. The future of the Ziffer Empire was uncertain, but it was now in Valara's hands. And with David by her side, she felt more prepared than ever to face whatever challenges lay ahead. David glanced at her, a small smile on his face. "You did it. You're the ruler now." Valara looked at him, her eyes softening. "I couldn't have done it without you. You were there when I needed you most." David stepped closer, his voice low. "And I'll always be here. Whatever happens, I'll stand by you." Valara smiled. A real smile, the first one he had seen in weeks. "I know." And for the first time, David felt like he had a place in this galaxy, beside her. Together, they would face the future, whatever it held. As they stood there, side by side, the future seemed bright. The challenges ahead were many, but together, they would face them. The storm had passed, and now it was time to build a new empire.